Tonight we step into the shadows of the human mind. In this first of two parts, we revisit a classic Art Bell session with Dr. Drew Ross. They dive deep into the chilling psychology behind serial killers, what drives them, how they think, and the warning signs that often go unnoticed. This isn't just about the crimes. It's about understanding why behind the unthinkable.
A murderous and bizarre crimes are in the headlines seemingly every day now. Benjamin Nathaniel Smith of Illinois, member of a hate cult, goes on a killing spree, murdering Asians and Jews, then commits suicide in Littleton, Colorado. 2 high school students massacre their fellow students, then commit suicide. Terry L. Nichols, convicted in the Oklahoma City bombing, is seeking files now in a bid for a new trial. Summer of Sam, a new Spike Lee film, is based on the son of Sam murderers. David Berkowitz, son of Sam murderer, is now said to be a model prisoner, counseling other prisoners. Charles Manson, Charlie. A Charles Manson follower and convicted murderer who stabbed the actress Sharon Tate 16 times in a bizarre cult murder some 30 years ago is now seeking parole, maybe in an area near you. What goes on in the mind of a murderer? In looking into the eyes of a killer, Dr. Drew Ross, who spent 7 years as a criminal forensic psychiatrist, reveals what he knows about murderers while he was on the job, what he found out about them, and tonight he's going to tell you. Dr. Ross, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Art.
You're way to the west of me, huh? You're out there in Hawaii someplace?
Yep, I'm on the big island of Hawaii.
You're on the big island. Doctor, what drew you into this particular field of medicine?
I was, at the time, very fascinated with the interplay of the brain and psychiatry, with the intersection of neurology and psychiatry, with how those things, people who had brain damage and epilepsy and those kind of things, and knew that a lot of people with those type of problems were in the criminal justice system, and wound up getting into it in that kind of backhanded way. My interest was actually not directly on that to start. And then once I began work in the field, I very quickly became totally intrigued with what I was looking at, with the issues of violence, with the very confusing intersection of law and psychiatry, and all of the tremendously difficult issues and questions that we had to answer for the courts and for the correctional system when working with these very difficult people.
Isn't it pretty strange to, I mean, what's it like to come face to face with one of these horrible murderers?
What's it feel like?
Yeah, do you come away? I mean, I just read, for example, model prisoner. Now, all of a sudden, a lot of these people on death row seem to suddenly embrace the Lord and the Bible, and they get religion. And you know, what's it like? Have you ever, for example, interviewed somebody totally unrepentant? I've seen interviews with Manson. He's not at all repentant.
There's definitely people that are unrepentant and that just offer no remorse, blame the victim. It was the victim's fault. The victim basically signed their own death warrant by messing with this person or by disobeying whatever street rules that killer believes in. There's definitely people that are just boldly unrepentant, and almost perhaps more frightening are the people that appear to be remorseful, but their remorse is only into the ears of the people that they want to hear it, that they don't act remorseful, they're not really remorseful, but they're trying to...
The parole board, most likely.
Right, the parole board, or if they think that the psychiatrist or psychologist can do something to help them, that they will try to pull one over on you and act remorseful. Those are in some way, for me, were more chilling, because they sometimes can start to get you going until especially if you're not observing them outside of the interview room, if you're just believing what they say to you and you don't watch how they talk to you.
Well, were you the psychiatrist that would sit down with these murderers at times and trying to determine if, in fact, they were truly repentant in some way, felt differently about everything, or masking it all so they can get out there and kill again?
Yeah, I did both treatment and evaluation, and the evaluations were a whole array of evaluations, including evaluations for the insanity defense, and evaluations related to sentencing, and also those that were related to whether someone who had been acquitted by reason of insanity and had been put in a secure hospital, whether they were ready to be released to a less secure setting. So the simple answer to your question is yes, I was a psychiatrist sitting with a person trying to make a report so that the court could make that decision.
That is a responsibility that would keep even a professional up very late at night sometimes, I would imagine, huh?
Yeah, it's a very difficult job, and whenever I would start to get a little bit relaxed, a little bit maybe even just a touch cocky, a feeling like I had it down, that I understood what was going on, that I kind of knew where my line was for whatever evaluation in question, where there was insanity or these other evaluations, that I kind of knew what was on the insane side and what wasn't. Whenever I started to feel like I was getting it, getting the hang of it, then it seemed like the very next evaluation, that defendant would be right on that line, would come from some different angle that challenged my whole system. Whenever I was just beginning to feel like I got it down, something would come along that would just throw my whole theory aside, and I'd have to kind of go back to the black.
Yeah. Do you, for example, in interviews of that sort, do you try to push certain buttons to see if you get the reaction that you expect you're going to get based on your evaluation of that person?
Sometimes you'll try to push a certain button, or you will be appearing to ask in a certain line and really trying to see what else is going on. A lot of times, though, by leaving a lot of open ground, the person gives you the information that you need. The person tends to trip up if they're trying to fool you when you give them more open questions, because they are prepared for narrower questions.
In other words, you give them enough rope to hang themselves.
Exactly. And the fact of the matter is that we tend to sometimes think of these people as being somewhat like some of the fictional characters of these brilliant, very educated, very bright, very sharp people. But the fact is, a lot of them are pretty impaired and are not very well educated and are not necessarily very sharp or slick at fooling you. A lot of times those attempts, especially when you've been doing it for a while, are not that hard to find. It's the rarer one that is the tougher one that can really get you going, that can be really slick. And there are those, and you always are watching for them.
There's been a change in America. At one time, you were most likely to be killed by somebody you know or love, or at least somebody you know, generally domestic disputes of one sort or another, that sort of thing. And that we turned some kind of corner where now you're more likely to be killed by somebody you don't know. And so something in America changed. While overall crime stats are down, the nature of crime seems to have changed. And the reasons they're committed, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting, because we maybe that explains the fact that people tend to overestimate their statistical danger. That people tend to not know that some of the statistics for crime are down, and people tend to believe that they're in more danger, tend to have a perception that they're more likely to be the victim of violent crime than statistically they are. And maybe it's that kind of wild card factor that you're talking about, the feeling that there are people out there and you have no idea of them. They're not somebody that you get to have any clues about. I mean, if you meet somebody and you become friends with somebody and then start to worry about them, at least you can separate from them, kind of cover your tracks. But when it's somebody that you don't know that just pops into your life out of nowhere, then certainly that's a far bigger fear for any of us.
Sure it is. Because there's no way to anticipate it or know about it, so it is naturally a bigger fear. A brief comment from you about sociopaths.
Sociopaths, the synonyms are antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, essentially mean all the same thing. And we're talking about people who have a disregard for other people. They generally have a repetitive pattern of not taking responsibility for their actions, criminal activity, often generally starting in childhood, and not taking responsibility in terms of relationships, in terms of child care, in terms of jobs, and a repetitive criminal activity. Very controversial issue in the intersection of mental health and the law, because it is technically a psychiatric diagnosis. It's in the book of diagnostic.
But you see what I'm driving at here is in the venue of what you presented to me, where does the sociopath fit in that picture? In those pictures,
they are going to be the toughest part, or one of the toughest parts of any system, and certainly the system I'm talking about, because the most effective ones of those, the ones that are very bright and very cunning, will try to learn that system and fake it out if all possible.
Sure.
That they will try to convince whatever board is overseeing them, whatever board is deciding whether they can move on to the next level, they are remarkably effective and adept at fooling people and convincing them that
yeah, they're the ones that'll go through your system like a hot knife through butter.
well, that's the danger. I think that you can design a system to make it more possible to catch that, more possible to be sure that that's not the case. But you're always worried. Something I talk about in the book. You're always worried about in the kind of work that I did. Is this the truth? Instead of, or is this the truth? Is it Memorex? Is this the truth? Is this a very effective psychopath that's fooling me?
What causes generally people to go to that edge, to kill, to commit very violent acts, or to murder? What pushes them over that edge?
Well, in most or maybe even all cases, there are multiple causes. And when you look closely at these cases, it's rarely one thing, although the media sometimes likes to pick up on that to simplify, and it's often overdetermined. That is to say that there's these multiple causes all, within that person's framework pushing them towards this. And, if one of those factors were to be dropped out, the person still would be violent. On a biological level, many of people who murder have some type of brain damage, some psychiatric or neurological problem, and there is the vast majority, in my experience, are under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time.
All right, you just said two very important things. The first is that most who kill have an actual physical, detectable mental malady. Is that correct?
Well, that's a matter of a lot of debate whether they have a detectable malady. Many of them do. Many of them have more subtle problems that are not necessarily immediately detectable, but if you do a big search for them, you'll find something. Although the age-old question is, if it's again usually a male, usually has had a rough life before they get to the point of murder, has been in fights, has been in brawls, has been in car accidents, are these problems something that caused them to live a violent lifestyle, or are they the products of a violent lifestyle?
Well, you know what? The American people mostly don't give a damn.
Right.
Right. And frankly, I'm one of them.
Sure.
And that brings us to the whole insanity defense.
Well, let me finish answering your question. There's a bunch of other things that cause violence.
Oh, good.
On a
okay,
historical level, a lot of these people have, although they will sometimes inappropriately use it as an excuse, they've often been abused, neglected, and certainly very rarely have been taught values. On a personal level, there is often, or perhaps almost always, a profound disconnection from the person's sense of who they are, what they believe, the heart and soul of the person, often profound sense of alienation from everyone and themselves, and shame. And on a social level, again, disconnected from a proper social environment, often connected to a violence-associated gang or group or belief system or subculture, and often very allied with the violent media and a high media exposure of violence.
Well, while, I certainly have compassion for their hard life, it would be manifested for me, Doctor, I would say, I'm so sorry you had a hard life. Drop the cyanide pellets now.
Well,
too rough for you?
Well, I'm, as a psychiatrist, I can't say I counsel anybody to commit suicide, but I want to be clear that when I'm talking about these causes,
I'm not suicide. I'm talking about
the person doesn't bear a responsibility for their behavior.
I'm talking about the gas chamber, not suicide.
Right. Well, I got to tell you that I'm not for the death penalty.
Good. Why not?
I believe that the death penalty represents the modern, an almost perfect modern analog for the so-called primitive culture's sacrifice, which of course was practiced in Hawaii in ancient times, and we're still figuring out why it was practiced here. But in current times with the death penalty, I believe that on a psychological level, we do the following thing as a culture. We take what are unacceptable parts of ourselves, our own aggression, our own hatred, our own intolerance, bigotry, our own violent urges, our aggression, the way that we are road rage, all of our stuff as a society, and we project it onto this violent person. The media exaggerates them, pumps it up, and then we kill that person, symbolically killing our own evil, our own unacknowledgeable, what we call the dark or shadow side.
You and
but
I,
of course,
Doctor, hold on, we got plenty of time.
Okay.
You and I are going to have a big disagreement with this about this, which is fine because it'll be good radio. As far as I'm concerned, if you would like to go back to throwing them into volcanoes, then I wouldn't have a problem with that. So hold it right there. We're at the bottom of the hour, and we'll come back and do more of this. Dr. Drew Ross is my guest. His book, Looking into the Eyes of a Killer.
Tell me down in the comments what you're thinking. I totally agree with this gentleman. He is very smart. He's really nailing it down for his diagnosis of what these guys are. It's good stuff. All right, back to these interviews. Tell me down in the comments what you think.
Once again, Dr. Drew Ross. And Dr. Ross, again, So that we're clear, I do not support a torturous method of eliminating a murderer, executing the death penalty. I think that a needle and good night is sufficient, and I don't think society needs to go to the level of those who have tortured their victims, but I do support the death penalty.
Well, I don't agree with you, but I think that it is an easier position to support, in my opinion, when you haven't worked in the criminal justice system. I don't know if you have, but
no, I haven't.
Having worked in the system and having seen when the criminal justice system doesn't work so well, we have seen recent cases in which a person sentenced to the death penalty was then later found to not have committed the crime.
That's true.
One of the other things is that we in the public tend to see the cases that the media is interested in, and of course, once you get media attention, both sides gear up. And the judge gears up. They do a whole different thing than for those cases where the cameras are not in the courtroom, where the families are not so interested, and where you've got not that much attention going on. And boy, it's a lot different type of court thing. A lot of corners are cut. A lot of things are done more quickly. And
yes.
Having been in the position that I'm in, where I have often spent, in many cases, probably more time with the defendant than anybody else in that courtroom except for their close family members, for me to know at that level, to my best estimate, what actually happened, and then to see what gets presented as happening and what gets judged, boy, I'll tell you, it really puts a different spin on things.
As a matter of curiosity, how do you take care that you yourself do not become victim of the Stockholm Syndrome?
Well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to explain the Stockholm Syndrome.
Well, the Stockholm Syndrome, you begin to identify with your captors. But you can translate that over to you begin to identify with the person that you've been counseling, the murderer, the convicted person that we're talking about here, the terrible killer. You begin to, in effect, see them for their human qualities, and a form of the Stockholm Syndrome, rather, is apparent in you. Do you watch for that?
Yeah, you do have to watch for that. Although part of doing what I do, part of being a psychiatrist, attempting to understand people, is looking at those human qualities. And you may accuse my book of looking in the eyes of the killer of being a Stockholm Syndrome, in the sense that one of the things I found is that these people are human, in the sense that they're portrayed by the media as being inhuman,
yes.
as being their reasons being completely out of the blue, and in general, their reasons are remarkably similar to our reasons why the rest of us think about being violent. That is, love, hatred, abandonment, rejection, et cetera, et cetera. The same kind of human emotions that lead the rest of us to get angry or hang up the phone or whatever lead these people to more severe actions. So
yes,
you can accuse me of being a living example of the Stockholm Syndrome. But I think that as a psychiatrist, you have to use that. Even with these most difficult people, you've got to use some degree of empathy in order to understand them, in order to understand their motivations. At the same time, you do have to be careful with over-identifying and beginning to believe their spin on the thing, which is often, obviously, an extremely distorted view of the world, and often an extremely distorted view of what they did. And you've got to be careful not to start empathizing so much that you begin to see things too clearly from their worldview and not the other options that they had.
In your view, Doctor, of the terrible killers that we are discussing tonight, and you list the worst ones, in the media material that you sent out, what percentage can be rehabilitated and safely put back on the street?
I can't give you a percentage, but I want to tell you that I'm not naive. I don't think that we need to say, oh, gee, it's the society's fault, and poor guy, and, we just need to give you a better chance and, a little bit of education. I mean, that is a very naive position, and we generally, in our country, seem to have oscillated between a more severe punishment model, and then we go to a kind of overly reform model where we're too lackadaisical, and then something happens and we go back and forth between the two. And so I've been sitting with these people, and certainly, I know what they're like if they're released, and I don't have a naive position that these people, it's an easy thing.
Well, then give me your realistic estimate. Surely you can tell me, perhaps 1 in 10 could be rehabilitated, or 1 in 20, or in your experience.
In my experience, I think it's probably well less than 1 in 10. I think it's more along the lines of 1 in 50 or 1 in 100.
1 in 100. And
that's just of the people I've seen. That's not a great statistical study.
All right. The alternative to the death penalty is life in prison.
In our current system, yes.
I take it you don't agree with that either.
Well, you know, I got to this place that the book kind of chronicles my journey into this bizarre world of work in which I entered into work with murderers and eventually out of it and the reasons I got out of it. And I surprised myself with where I came, that I came to feel that the criminal justice system as it is was not working, or at least I could not take part in it. And I began to question the idea of the state being able to inflict punishment, the state with all of its frailties, with all of its inaccuracies, with all of its foibles and political squabbles and corrupt dealings, having the authority to decide how to punish its citizens. And I was really surprised. I didn't walk in there with that kind of an opinion. I was much closer to I think where you were when I walked in there, and I came to see how frail this system was.
If not the state, Doctor, then who?
Well, I think that the model that I would have is a model of personal responsibility, and if you think that is an easy model, in a lot of ways, a lot of the people I would be giving some of the people less rights in the sense that I would want to follow these people. There would have to be some system of isolation. You could say that would be prison as it is now, but I don't think prison as it is now with the rapes that occur, with the violence that is tolerated. I don't want it to be like that.
Then what would you see in
there would have to be a system of isolation. There would have to be a way in which you could keep someone for a long period of time out of the circulation so that they could not hurt anybody else.
Well, what is
the
that,
person's
Doctor?
introduction back into society would be based upon their proven record of behavior with lots of little steps. It wouldn't be, here's your $10, there's the door, you've done your time, and in the meantime you've learned how to become more violent in prison. It would be, including the time that they were out of isolation, they would still be monitored. They would still have a gradation of their ability of what they could do, of what they were allowed to do, based on their behavior and their responsibility, with always the ability that at the point that they don't do what they need to do, that they back up in the system and they go into more supervision and more control over their behavior, so that we can always pull them, if it's a serious crime, we can always pull them backwards and watch them more closely. And it's not an issue of total confinement and in many cases extreme punishment, and then complete freedom and with just hoping that the police will catch them if they do it again.
Doctor, please, let's talk practicality for a second. Without the system of jails, as we now know them, what form of isolation would serve?
Well, the thing is that this is one of the problems what I'm talking about, because immediately what I'm talking about there'd be a great temptation for the system to just turn it back into a jail and just to call it something different. There would have to be isolation. What I would have different about that system is that in there, rather than having the tolerance of violence that we have, rather than having the tolerance of sexual violence that we have, that there would be, that first of all, only the people that need to be isolated would we be paying to isolate. And we put a significant number of people in prison that if you and I looked at it, they would not be dangerous to other people. We're putting them in to punish them for what they did, but we could put them somewhere else, somewhere cheaper.
Okay, you're not going to get an argument from me there. In other words, we've got a lot of people in there on drug charges and all the rest of it, even the greatest percentage. And I think that's ridiculous and insane. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about murderers. Now, you tell me how you isolate a murderer in an environment that is not a jail. I want to know what that would be.
The only difference between the main difference between what I'm talking about and what we now call jail and prison is the issue of punishment and the feel of the place. I don't know if you've spent very much time in them, but they are places in which an enormous amount, in many cases, I don't want to say all cases, in many cases an enormous amount of physical and sexual cruelty is tolerated, in some cases even promoted, and places in which there is an enormous amount of physical and emotional violence inflicted among the various people there, sometimes, unfortunately, including the guards. I don't want to.
Yeah, jail's a rough place.
It's a very difficult job.
Jail's a rough place.
Right.
Okay, fine. So
the question is, what are we training there? What are we paying for? We're paying a lot of money for people to be there. What are we paying for? Are we paying for people to become less violent? Because let's face it, not all of them are going to serve a life sentence, even if it's a serious violent crime.
Okay,
not all of them are going to be there
we're not talking about the whole, at least I hope we're not, the whole justice system now and the whole variety of crimes. We're talking about murderers. All right?
Right. But not everyone who commits murder serves a life sentence.
That's right. They don't.
A lot of them get out. And
That's
how
true.
do they get out? What are they like? What have we done to them during the time that they've been in prison? I mean, I have to say that one of the things that prison as it is does, what it does now when it's a long sentence, is it involves time. It involves the person grows older, and we know statistically that as these are usually men, that as these men age, they are less likely to commit a violent crime. But in terms of what they've been exposed to in prison, in terms of what the feel of that place is, what they've been trained to do, the way that they've been trained to survive, what have we done in that regard? And spend some time in a prison or jail, and it's a chilling place.
Okay, what, for example, is Charlie Manson going to learn in jail that we should be worried about?
Well, Charlie Manson is obviously an exception. I mean, he's not going to, whatever,
He's one of the names you listed.
Right. Or what is he going to learn in jail that we should be worried about?
That's
right. He might learn in jail that he can do it again, that he can get people to follow him, that a bright person who's a slick talker and who gets other people to follow him, he may learn that he can do that if God forbid he were to get out, that he could do that again in terms of getting people to follow him, because I would not be surprised to the extent that he has contact with other prisoners that he's able to be something of a unfortunate leader because of his personal characteristics.
No doubt. Well, there's a lot of people who feel that Charlie Manson shouldn't be around to even be lobbying for parole. That Charlie Manson shouldn't even be alive right now. But what I'm saying is, with respect to prisons, and just sticking with that argument for a second, I can't imagine with these serial killers, most of the names that you've listed here, that any of them would learn anything in prison, and that they should ever be out of prison. And I can't imagine any alternative to prison as we presently have it. Prison is a rough place. I mean, what do you propose to turn it into? A place where they're not exposed to the possibility of violence while they're in prison?
Well, I think it would be possible, especially if you take the other people out, the people that don't need isolation. I think that it is possible to make a place in which violence is not tolerated. And I think that if we have a place that violence is not tolerated, we're going to serve everybody better, including the public.
Prisons are presently little societies of their own, where in many cases the prisoners run the asylum.
Right.
And the guards know it, and everybody else knows it.
Right.
And how the hell would you change that? I don't see how you would change it.
Well, we get into a lot of details there. Part of it is the problem of numbers, that we're sentencing so many people that we overwhelm our systems. Part of it is also the physical design of the places. A lot of these places have been built a long time ago, built not to house as many people as they have. We've also got a strange system now where on the one hand we have this very punitive model that I'm talking about, and on the other hand we've had generations of prison civil rights attorneys litigating for weird rights that wind up making it possible for these people to be violent again. Weird rights of where they're able to go and what they're able to do, and whether they're able to have television and have things in their jail that they can use, in their cell that they can use as weapons. We've got this weird mix of a real punitive thing on the one hand and then so-called prison rights on the other hand that actually make it more possible for them.
We've got people arranging crimes from the inside.
Right.
Running underworld.
Running rings. Exactly.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
So, in other words, you seem to lean toward a more pleasant atmosphere for these incarcerated people.
Well, that's the thing, is that I want to make it more pleasant for them. And you're right in the sense that the time that they'd be in isolation would be more pleasant, but the time in which they were out, if any of these people would get out, I'm not talking about serial killers, but people who've committed one violent crime often get out. The time that they would be out would actually, probably they'd rather have your system, unless you're going to kill them all. They'd probably have rather your system in mind, because I would be monitoring them. They would be, the stuff of their rights in terms of privacy would be gone, because we'd be watching them. Their behavior would have to be monitored. They would be, and the steps out of that isolation would be very progressive and slow. That they'd go from instead of maximum security, medium security, minimum security camp and out, there'd be a lot more ranges of slowly moving that person out so we can watch them and see what they're going to do, so that it's not a matter of what they say to the parole board, of what they say to someone, or just the expiration of their sentence, which is what really scares me.
Yes.
But an issue of their behavior. What do they do? What do they show when given that rope? Do they hang themselves in it, or do they begin to change or not? The problem we have now is we've got to remember that in general, what I'm talking about are not the Manson people, not the people that the public light is on. It's the guy that did the stick up and killed somebody and got such a sentence and has not gotten the disciplinary reports, and the prison is getting crowded, the guy's getting a little older, and he's the guy that's getting out. That's the people I'm talking about.
Raise your voice when you should reinforce your argument. And I'm going to try to keep it that way with you, Doctor, as we touch on these very, very, very controversial topics. I'd rather, I guess, reason with you than the temptation is to raise one's voice. It's so emotional. These things are so emotional. But we were talking about, let's go back to where we were. Somebody goes in, and murders a young teenage girl working in a 7-Eleven or so whatever. And I can't imagine why this person, why society doesn't have a right, why that girl's family doesn't have a right to justice. And what is justice? Well, justice is, in my eyes, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It really is, Doctor. And if that is not justice, tell me why it isn't.
Well, there's three things. One is the issue of the accuracy of, was it the person that you think it was that killed the girl? The second issue is the power that we wish to give our state. And in my work, as chronicled in my book, Looking into the Eyes of a Killer, I found that the state is not nearly as accurate in the criminal justice system as we would have them be, especially when the media and the public is not looking. The third thing, and the third thing we haven't touched on, is the question of where do we want to go? Where do we want to go as a species? Where do we want to go as a society? Mm-hmm. And when we endorse capital punishment, we, as a society, to the extent that our government really is by the people, then we are killing that person who killed the girl.
Yes, we are.
And I don't think that killing stops killing. I think killing generates killing. You do? Yes.
Well, it certainly stops that person from doing it again.
You're right. Yeah. And that is the attraction. That is the attraction of the death penalty, and that's where it's...
Actually, my position, Doctor, is that the death penalty, if it's ineffective, is ineffective because most death penalty prisoners sit laughing at society for sometimes about 10 years before that is finally exacted. And if the death penalty were implemented with quick appeals, I'm not in favor of taking away the appeals process, but relatively quick appeals, and in cases where there seems no doubt, and a jury of peers has said death penalty, then carry it out.
Well, a lot of people have said that. First of all, I doubt that people, waiting for that moment when they're going to be killed are laughing at society. There's some that are, but I think that most of them are not. The second issue is this issue of doubt, because the juries are often very sure, the prosecutors are often very sure, and yet when you look at the cases, there are some real glaring problems in some of the cases. And of course, statistically, there are some real worrisome issues. The death penalty cases are generally minorities. They're generally people that are quite poor. There is an overrepresentation of those groups, even within the larger group of murderers. So there's some real worrisome things about the use of the death penalty in this country. And of course, you touched on another thing which you want to change, and that is the fact that the death penalty is very expensive. It takes years and years, and generally, I believe, costs us in its current system more than life in prison.
That's actually a true statement, but that is another thing to complain about with respect to the entire system of incarceration and punishment and the justice system, the whole rest of it. In other words, it could be relatively inexpensive, much cheaper to execute than it could be to keep a prisoner for life if it were done properly. The way we do it, yes, you're correct. It's more expensive because it is in itself an insane process.
Right, but I want to say to you, the word insane is a good one, because that was what I was working with and what I talk about in my book, that the problem is as you get closer into this system, as you get into it and you sit in the courtrooms, and you go to the prisons and you go to the jails, the system starts to look more and more insane. You start to see the holes. You start to see the places where the injustice is done, the plea bargains that aren't right, the situations in which the person that's accused doesn't know what's going on. And the whole system starts to break down the closer you look at it. It is far easier to come up with things that sound swift and just when you're thinking in the abstract. But when you're dealing with living beings and the state of evidence, we tend to think of these, wonderful new FBI things that we come up with, but the vast majority of the cases, the evidence is a whole lot weaker than that. And there is this enormous presumption of guilt because statistically, the person accused usually is guilty. And there's this enormous presumption of guilt that happens in these cases, and it's really frightening when you've gotten close into the case and there are some holes in the case that never get presented.
Doctor, why should psychiatry, frankly, and this is my view, be at all involved in the process of punishment for capital crime?
Well, a lot of psychiatrists don't want psychiatry to be involved in the issue of capital punishment because, as physicians, our job is healing, and the issue of the death penalty is killing someone. So a lot of psychiatrists agree with you. The reason why it's there from a procedural standpoint is the issue of whether someone, generally there's a number of issues, but one of them that's the most harrowing is the issue of someone's competence to be executed. The idea that in order for the state to be able to kill someone, they have to, that convict has to be competent to receive his penalty. It's usually his or her penalty. And, of course, that creates a bizarre situation of potentially medicating someone in order to then put them to death. It's a real bizarre twist, a real strange use of psychiatry. There are other places in which psychiatrists can get involved in terms of psychiatric issues being mitigating circumstances such that the death penalty might be discarded and a life sentence instead.
Why should a person's past mitigate a capital crime at all?
Well, again, you know, you're asking a person who doesn't believe in the death penalty, but the issue is that the idea that the death penalty is to be used for those clear-cut kind of cases you were talking about, and the issue is if the person has a mental illness, and if the mental illness played some kind of a role in the crime, then maybe this was not as clear-cut, as crystal clear of a case of the type that you were talking about earlier, that maybe this is something that muddies the water enough for the finder of fact to decide to not give this person a death penalty.
With due respect, Doctor, a lot of us feel that what you do is take what is a clear-cut case and muddy the waters.
Well, that there very well may be people in my profession that do that. My personal experience, as I talk about in my book, has been something of the opposite. That when I got into the case, and what the issues were, that I was in muddy water, and when it got presented in court, it sometimes was presented as a whole lot clearer than the facts, from my viewpoint, admittedly, seemed to be. So from my experience, I would say the opposite, but there very well may be people in my profession who do exactly that. I can't represent all of us.
Of the murderers that you have had an opportunity to work with, how many would that be over the years, do you suppose?
The number of people that murdered over the years, that's a good question.
Just a rough guess.
I'm going to guess that the number is around 100, although the book covers the book takes the reader with me as I interview various people and confront the issues. It's obviously a far less number that's covered in the book in order to get some detail and some information across. Okay,
but in your career in this regard, you're saying about 100, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
Of that number, how many did you conclude were innocent?
Well, I've never had the job of deciding guilt or innocence.
Well, in interviewing, we all know that in prison a lot of people, just about everybody's innocent. They were framed. But in your work, in getting into their psyches, how many did you personally conclude of that number were innocent?
I got to add one more thing. One of the things with the insanity defense is technically an insanity acquittee is not guilty by reason of insanity. I think you're asking me something different. You're asking me how many of them that I think did not do it.
That's right. That's what I'm asking.
And I want to say that I'm thinking that about two. One that I'm really honing in on, and I think there was a second as well.
Completely innocent. In other words, you actually concluded they were innocent, didn't do the crime.
In my mind, I would not have the ability to know for sure. But on the basis of what I saw, it would be my belief that they did not actually do the crime.
Mm-hmm. 2 of 100. All right, let's talk about the insanity defense for a moment. I take it that in your career...
I just want to say 2 of 100 is a small number, but let's think of 2 of 100 putting them to death, and that number starts to loom a lot larger.
Yes, it does. It's an argument. No doubt about it.
And I also want to say in your defense that we're talking about the people that get examined by a psychiatrist are the more confusing cases, the ones in which insanity is an issue, the ones in which there are problems with evidence, the ones in which it's not a straightforward case because we never see the ones in which there's no question of mental illness and that it's a totally straightforward case. So in your defense, that number would probably not be the accurate number if I were to see every case that came through.
You think it would be far smaller?
It would be smaller.
Doctor, in my mind, no matter how desperate the straits may be for a person, to go into a 7-Eleven, I mean, there was a day in America when most crimes of that sort, robberies, did not end up with a bullet through the brain of the poor clerk. But in modern America, for some reason, it seems like we hear more times about somebody going in, robbing a 7-Eleven, taking the money, beginning to back out of the store, and putting a bullet through the head of the clerk as an afterthought. Mm-hmm. You with me here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, by what measure is that not insane?
This is an age-old question. I mean, many people who I've talked to about my job have said, isn't anybody who kills somebody
That's what I just said.
insane?
Yes.
I mean, isn't that an act of...
Let me qualify it a little bit. In other words, I know that if a husband comes home, finds his wife in bed with somebody else, you don't necessarily call that... or put that in the same sort of category as you do the person who, as an afterthought, puts a bullet through a clerk's head on the way out after a robbery. Right?
Although, to be honest with you, the one in which it's the husband is often closer legally speaking, closer to the insanity defense than the other.
Well, that would be a temporary insanity.
Right, exactly.
Right? Okay. Well, that I can almost buy into that. I think most Americans can. But this,
although it's a real tough examination to figure out.
Yeah, but this casual killing, how can you not call that insane? That's the question.
Okay. I talk about this a lot in my book, Looking into the Eyes of the Killer, about the issue of the insanity defense and how it's defined. And the insanity defense is defined legally, and it's defined by statute, and it varies from state to state, and there's a federal statute for federal crimes, and these statutes can differ. So literally, technically speaking, the same crime can be found insane in one state and not found insane in another because of the difference in definition.
Right.
That said, the definitions use words that can be very difficult for those of us who have had to make these determinations for the court. They use words like substantial impairment. And what is substantial when you're talking about impairment? It's a very, very difficult examination and decision to make. But to answer your question more directly, these things are defined statutorily by the legislature. And they generally say, first of all, you've got to have some kind of mental illness to begin with. Second of all, that mental illness has to impair either the person's ability to appreciate whether that the act was wrong or was against the law, or their ability to behave, their ability to conform their conduct is the language that's often used. This is I'm using a standard called the American Law Institute Standard, which is used in a lot of states. And it differs from state to state and federal thing. But so there is a legal definition of this, and the mental health person is asked to make this determination according to the standard. So one of the questions you get in with your person in the 7-Eleven is there the presence of a mental illness? And again, one of the difficulties with that is it depends on how hard you look for it. Are you looking just for a previous history that the person has actually been hospitalized or saw a mental health practitioner, or are you going to do an exhaustive search where you're doing CAT scans and MRI scans and all kinds of stuff looking for something? And then you've got to look for those other things, that the mental illness specifically impaired their ability to basically know what they did or appreciate what they did was wrong, or their ability to behave accordingly, to conform their conduct. And if that sounds murky to you, it is murky.
It is, yeah, it does sound murky to me. And to me, it's far simpler. To me, it's why doesn't society owe the husband of that woman, the family of that woman, justice, which I consider in this case to be an eye for an eye? That is very straightforward. And how is it defeated by your murky argument?
Well, the issue is that you're using an example. The question is if you get something in which the illness is more obvious, in which you have somebody who has had a psychotic illness for years, has been hearing voices, and is paranoid by virtue of this illness, and whose relative, whose uncle has been beating this person for years, and the person comes to believe by virtue of their illness that these beatings are part of a conspiracy that this uncle was part of to do harm to other members of the family, and that this uncle is going to kill the rest of the family, and the only choice that this person has to save the family is to kill the uncle. And so the question then is, is the family owed for that person who has a psychotic illness to be killed?
I agree there are degrees of homicide, and that's why we have degrees of homicide. Mm-hmm. But when you get down to premeditated murder in the first degree, that's where I think you and I go down different paths.
Well, I have to tell you that I have had problems with the insanity defense as well, and I talk about this a lot in my book because it shines a weird light on this whole issue. It shines a strange light on the criminal justice system and kind of gets you into the inner workings of this issue of guilt and innocence, and it really starts to get more and more bizarre the more that you work in it. And to me, I'm telling you how it works and how these decisions are made. Sure. But the fact of the matter is it's very, very difficult, and you get into startling issues of how ill. What do you do when the person is very ill, but also kind of diabolical in a way? That they're both, to use the layman's term, they're both evil and ill. They're bad and mad. Mm-hmm. What in that case? And that is not infrequent. I mean, that happens. I've seen it. And so, I'm telling you how the insanity defense works, and it does serve a purpose in the sense that there's sort of an intuitive understanding that there's some people that are so ill that what they did was not murder in the way that we think of murder.
All right, Doctor. And I think, on that note, listen, I've got a break on the call.
Well, that was a very interesting interview. I really enjoyed that. It's a great lecture. Go ahead and Listen to part 2. It only gets better. This is incredible. All right, thanks for listening. See you in part 2.